The winter of 1925 settled over the Wyoming Valley like a familiar blanket, heavy and white and utterly silent except for the crackling of wood in the stone fireplace. Elijah McAllister sat in his rocking chair, 98 years old now, his hands weathered and spotted with age but still steady as they rested on the armrests. The fire cast dancing shadows across the room, illuminating the photographs that lined the mantel, faces frozen in time, moments preserved against the relentless march of years. His granddaughter Emma sat cross-legged on the braided rug before him, 16 years old and filled with the kind of curiosity that comes from knowing there are stories yet untold, secrets still hidden in the silences between words. She had her grandmother's eyes, dark and searching, and when she looked up at now, Elijah saw in her face the echo of a woman who had changed everything about the life he thought he understood. "Grandpa," Emma said, her voice soft in the quiet room, "how did you meet Grandma? I mean, really meet her? Everyone says she was Apache, but nobody talks about how you two actually found each other." Elijah closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, they held the weight of 40 years of memory, of loss and redemption, of a journey that began in the deepest cold he had ever known. "Do you have time, child?" he asked, his voice still strong, despite his age, still carrying the authority of a man who had once commanded respect on cavalry lines and in wilderness camps. "It's a long story." Emia nodded, pulling a quilt around her shoulders and settling in closer to the fire. Elijah took a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried them both backward through time, through decades, through the accumulated years to a winter that had nearly killed him before it saved him. "December of 1885, he began. "I found the woman who would become your grandmother lying half dead in the snow, buried under a fallen pine branch with frost in her eyelashes and her lips turned the color of winter violets. And if it hadn't been for that storm, if I hadn't followed those tracks that morning, I would have died alone in that cabin, frozen not by the cold but by the emptiness I'd wrapped around myself like armor." He paused, his gaze distant now, fixed on something Emma couldn't see, a window opening onto a past she could only imagine. "But I'm getting ahead of myself," he said. "Let me start where it truly began. With the morning I decided, after 4 years of hiding from the world, that maybe I was still alive for a reason." The memory took him then, pulled him down through the years until he could feel the bite of that December wind on his face, could see the cabin as it had been, small and isolated and perfect for a man who wanted nothing more than to disappear. December 1885, Northern Wyoming Territory. Elijah Ward McAllister, 58 years old, stood in the doorway of his cabin and studied the sky with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years reading weather patterns for the United States Cavalry. The clouds hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that would fall before nightfall, heavy and relentless. He could smell it in the air, that particular metallic scent that preceded a serious storm, the kind that could bury a man's mistakes along with his cabin if he wasn't careful. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him against the cold that immediately found every gap in his clothing, every exposed inch of skin. At 58, he was still a big man, broad across the shoulders and solid through the chest. His hair more gray than brown now, his face carved with lines that spoke of hard weather and harder choices. A scar ran along his jawline, a reminder of a Sioux knife that had come too close during a skirmish near the Powder River in 1876. His hands, calloused and strong, bore the marks of labor, the kind of work that kept a man busy enough not to think too much about the silence. He wore his old cavalry coat, the blue wool faded to almost gray, the brass buttons tarnished but still holding fast. On his feet were boots he had resoled 3 times, and around his waist hung a leather belt with a holster that held a Colt revolver he cleaned every week but hadn't fired in 4 years. The woodpile needed restocking. It always needed restocking. Elijah hefted the axe from where it leaned against the cabin wall and walked to the logs he had stacked in the fall, each piece cut to the precise length that would fit his stove without wasting heat or wood. He set the first log on the chopping block and raised the axe, bringing it down with the controlled force of long practice. The wood split clean, falling in 2 perfect halves. He worked steadily, the rhythm of the axe familiar and almost meditative, each swing a repetition of the hundreds of thousands that had come before. Split, stack, repeat. Split, stack, repeat. The physical labor kept his body warm and his mind carefully blank, which was exactly how he preferred it. But this morning, as he bent to retrieve another log, his left leg protested with a sharp spike of pain that ran from his hip down through his knee. He paused, breathing through it, waiting for the ache to subside to its usual dull throb. The leg had been broken in a fall from a horse during his last cavalry posting, and though it had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent reminder that he was no longer the young scout who could ride for 3 days without rest. Winter made it worse. The cold settled into the old brake like an unwelcome guest, and on mornings like this, he felt every one of his 58 years. He finished the wood splitting and carried an armload back to the cabin, kicking the door open with his boot and depositing the logs in the box beside the stove. The interior of the cabin was sparse, almost monastic in its simplicity. One room, one bed, one table, two chairs, though he never had company, one stove that served for both cooking and heat. On the wall above the table hung a single shelf, and on that shelf sat a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. Elijah set the wood down and stood before that photograph for a long moment, as he did every morning, studying the faces captured there in shades of silver and gray. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in the fashion of the day. A boy, perhaps 7 or 8, with a gap-toothed smile in his father's chin. Sarah and Thomas, his wife, his son, both dead these 4 years. "Morning, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice rough in the empty room. "Morning, Thomas." He didn't expect an answer, he never had. But the ritual of greeting them, of acknowledging their continued presence in his life, even if only in memory, had become as necessary as breathing. The guilt lived in his chest like a second heart, beating its steady rhythm beneath everything else. He had been away when they died, away on a scouting mission that his commanding officer had insisted could not wait, away when the plague had swept through Fort Laramie with brutal efficiency, taking the very young and the very old, and everyone in between who was unlucky enough to be in its path. By the time the telegram reached him, by the time he had ridden 3 days without stopping, pushing his horse to the edge of collapse, and then beyond, Thomas was already in the ground and Sarah was in the final hours of her fever. He had sat beside her bed, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness, and in one of her lucid moments she had looked at him with eyes that didn't quite focus and asked, "Is Thomas safe? Did you keep our boy safe?" And Elijah, knowing the truth would only bring her pain in her last moments, had lied. "He's safe," he had said, squeezing her hand. "He's sleeping." She had smiled then, a small, peaceful smile, and whispered, "Good, I can rest now." She died 20 minutes later, never knowing that her son was already gone, never knowing that Elijah's last words to her had been a desperate fiction designed to spare her the unbearable truth. He had resigned his commission the next morning and disappeared into the wilderness, finding this cabin through a trapper who owed him a favor, paying for it with his mustering out pay and the small savings Sarah had kept hidden in a coffee tin. For 4 years he had lived here alone, speaking to no one, seeing no one, existing in a self-imposed exile that felt more like penance than survival. A father should have been there. A husband should have protected his family. He had failed at both, and so he had removed himself from the world of families and protection, had chosen instead to live with the company of his guilt and the memory of 2 faces in a silver frame. Elijah turned from the photograph and pulled on his heaviest gloves. The trap line needed checking, storm or no storm. He had 6 snares set in a rough circle about a quarter-mile from the cabin, placed along game trails he had scouted carefully in the fall. The traps provided meat through the winter, rabbit mostly, sometimes a fox or marten, whose pelt he could trade when he made his twice-yearly trip to the trading post 20 miles south. He took his rifle from its place beside the door, checked the load out of habit, and stepped back into the cold. The snow had begun to fall, small, dry flakes that stung when they hit exposed skin, the kind of snow that meant business. Elijah pulled his hat down lower and started along the trail he had worn through repeated use, his boots breaking through the top crust of older snow with each step. He was halfway to the first trap when he saw them. Footprints. Elijah stopped, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and studied the tracks that cut across his path. They were fresh, unobscured by the falling snow, which meant whoever had made them had passed this way within the last hour. The prints were small, too small to be a man's, the stride length short and irregular. He knelt, ignoring the protest from his bad leg, and examined the tracks more closely. Boot prints, not moccasins, but worn boots with the left heel slightly more degraded than the right. The depth of the impressions varied, deeper on some steps, shallower on others, suggesting someone who was struggling, whose energy was failing with each step. And there, at the edge of one print, a small, dark spot that had melted the snow around it. Blood. Elijah's pulse quickened despite himself. For 4 years, he had seen no one out here, had chosen this location precisely because of its isolation. The nearest settlement was a 2-day ride on horseback, and the few trappers who worked these mountains knew to give each other wide berth. These tracks, this blood, represented an intrusion into the carefully constructed solitude he had built. His first instinct was to ignore them, to continue to his trap line and let whoever had made these tracks solve their own problems. He had walked away from the world. He had no obligation to its troubles. But even as the thought formed, he saw another image superimposed over the tracks in the snow. A small boy's face, gap-toothed and smiling, trusting that his father would always be there to keep him safe. Thomas. Elijah closed his eyes and took a slow breath. He couldn't save Thomas. He couldn't save Sarah. But someone had walked past his cabin in the middle of an approaching blizzard, bleeding and struggling. And if he turned away now, if he let them disappear into the white wilderness to freeze or bleed to death alone, then what was the point of his own survival? What was the point of 4 years of penance if he couldn't even extend a hand to another human being in desperate need? Damn it, he muttered, the words swallowed by the wind. He turned and began following the tracks, moving quickly now, his cavalry training reasserting itself after years of disuse. Track fast, track careful. Watch for signs of ambush or deception. The prince led northwest, away from his cabin and deeper into the rough country, toward the ravine that cut through the ridge like a wound. As he walked, the snow began to fall harder, the flakes larger now, clustering together as they descended. The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways, and Elijah knew he had perhaps an hour before the tracks would be completely obscured, before whoever had made them would be impossible to find. He increased his pace, half running now, despite the complaints from his leg, his eyes fixed on the trail. The spacing between the prints grew more erratic. Here the person had stumbled, one knee dropping to the snow. There they had caught themselves against a tree, the bark scraped clean where a hand had grasped for support. The tracks led down the slope toward the ravine, and Elijah's concern deepened. The ravine was treacherous even in good weather, filled with deadfall and hidden drops, and in a storm it became a death trap. He reached the edge and looked down, scanning the white landscape for any sign of movement. There, beneath a massive pine tree whose branches had bent under the weight of snow, until several had snapped and fallen, creating a tangle of green needles and brown wood, he saw a splash of color that didn't belong to the winter palette. Dark fabric, black hair. Elijah half slid, half ran down the slope, his rifle slung across his back, his hands grabbing at rocks and roots for balance. When he reached the fallen tree, he dropped to his knees and began pulling away the branches, working quickly but carefully, afraid of what he might find underneath. His first clear view stopped him cold. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, lay curled on her side beneath the heaviest branch. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, had come loose from its bindings and spread across the snow like spilled ink. She wore a dress of deerskin, beautifully made, with intricate beadwork across the bodice. But the dress was torn badly at the shoulder and along one side, exposing skin that had turned an alarming shade of mottled blue and purple from the cold. Her face, what he could see of it, was delicate-featured, her skin a warm brown that even the cold hadn't entirely leached away. But her lips had gone the color of winter lilacs, and when he pressed 2 fingers against her throat, searching for a pulse, her skin felt like touching ice. For a terrible moment, he thought he was too late, that he had found nothing but a beautiful corpse. But then he felt it, a flutter beneath his fingertips, faint and irregular, but present, a heartbeat, life, however tenuous. "Hold on," he said, though he had no idea if she could hear him. "Just hold on." He lifted the branch off her with strength born of desperation, tossing it aside and then scooping his arms beneath her body. She weighed almost nothing, far too light for an adult woman, and when he lifted her against his chest, her head lolled against his shoulder with the boneless quality of complete unconsciousness. The torn dress revealed more injuries, a long, dark bruise along her ribs that suggested either a bad fall or a brutal blow, scratches on her arms that wept small amounts of blood, and her hands, when he glanced at them, were raw and abraded, as if she had been clawing her way through rough terrain. This was no accident. This was someone who had been running for her life. Elijah adjusted his grip, cradling her more securely, and began the climb back up the ravine slope. His bad legs screamed in protest, threatening to buckle with each step, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through the pain. He had carried wounded men across worse terrain during the war, had dragged unconscious soldiers through mud and blood and chaos. This was no different, except that it was, because this young woman reminded him suddenly and painfully of what Thomas might have become if he had lived, if he had grown up and perhaps had children of his own, children who might one day need a stranger's mercy in a blizzard. The climb took everything he had. By the time he reached the top of the ravine, his breath came in ragged gasps that burned his lungs. His leg had gone from pain to a kind of numb screaming, and his arms trembled with the effort of keeping her secure. But he didn't stop. He turned toward the cabin and began walking, one step at a time, each step a small victory against the cold and the wind and his own failing body. The snow had become a full blizzard now, the wind howling across the open spaces with a voice like wolves, the visibility reduced to mere yards. Elijah navigated by instinct and long familiarity, trusting his feet to find the path even when his eyes could barely make out the shapes of trees. When the cabin finally emerged from the white wall of the storm, he nearly wept with relief. He kicked the door open and staggered inside, crossing immediately to the bed and laying the young woman down as gently as his shaking arms would allow. She didn't stir, didn't make a sound. Her breathing had become so shallow he had to put his ear close to her mouth to confirm she was still pulling air. Elijah moved with the efficiency of old training, his cavalry years asserting control over the situation. First, heat. He opened the stove and began feeding it wood, not the careful rationing he normally practiced, but great armfuls of fuel, stoking the fire until it roared and the metal of the stove ticked and creaked with expansion. Second, dry clothes and warmth. He pulled every blanket he owned from the chest at the foot of the bed, thick wool blankets he had bought from a trader 3 years ago, and began layering them over her. The wet deerskin dress had to come off, or the moisture would continue drawing heat from her body, but his hands hesitated at the task. She was unconscious, possibly dying, and modesty was a luxury neither of them could afford, but still he felt the wrongness of it, the violation of undressing a woman who couldn't consent. He compromised by working carefully and quickly, easing the torn dress down and replacing it immediately with a blanket, preserving what dignity he could while prioritizing her survival. The bruise on her ribs was worse than he had thought, a purple-black bloom that covered her entire left side from armpit to hip, broken ribs possibly, or at the very least badly bruised. Once she was covered, he turned his attention to warming water. She would need fluids, warmth from the inside as well as out. He filled a pot with snow and set it on the stove, adding a pinch of salt from his dwindling supply. While the water heated, he examined her more carefully. The tears in the skin on her arms and hands were superficial, the kind of scrapes someone got from running through brush and branches without regard for obstacles. The bruising on her ribs was the most serious visible injury, but what worried him more was the color of her skin, the way the cold had penetrated so deeply. Advanced hypothermia. He had seen it before, during Winard's campaigns in the Dakotas. Men who looked peaceful and still on the outside while their core temperature dropped to levels incompatible with life. The key was slow, steady rewarming. Too fast and the shock could kill as surely as the cold. The water came to a gentle simmer and he poured it into a tin cup, waiting for it to cool to a temperature that wouldn't burn. When he lifted her head and tried to get her to drink, her lips parted slightly, but she couldn't swallow. Most of the water ran down her chin. He tried again, more patient this time, letting just drops fall onto her tongue, and finally she swallowed reflexively, a tiny victory. He continued this process for the next hour, alternating between giving her water drop by drop and adding wood to the fire, keeping the cabin as warm as he could make it. Slowly, incrementally, color began to return to her face. Her lips faded from purple to a pale pink. Her breathing, while still shallow, became more regular. Elijah pulled the single chair close to the bed and sat, watching her with the focused attention of a sentry on duty. The storm raged outside, the wind finding every crack in the cabin's walls and keening through with voices that sounded almost human. But inside, the fire kept them warm and the walls held strong, and the young woman in his bed continued to breathe. It was well into the afternoon when her eyelids finally fluttered. Elijah leaned forward, every sense alert. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, dark brown irises that seemed to take a long moment to register where she was and what she was seeing. Then she saw him. Her reaction was immediate and violent. She tried to sit up, her eyes going wide with fear, her hands scrabbling at the blankets as if searching for a weapon. A sound emerged from her throat, something between a gasp and a scream, and she recoiled backward, pressing herself against the wall behind the bed. Elijah stood immediately and backed away, his hands rising in a gesture of peace, putting as much distance between them as the small cabin would allow. "Easy," he said, his voice low and calm, the same tone he had used with spooked horses during his cavalry days. "You're safe. I found you in the snow. You were dying." She stared at him, her breathing rapid and panicked, her eyes darting around the cabin, taking in the rifle by the door, the lack of other people, the single room with its single exit behind where Elijah now stood. She said something in a language he didn't understand, her voice cracking with disuse and fear, the words rapid and desperate. "I don't speak Apache," Elijah said, guessing at her heritage from the style of her dress and the beadwork he had glimpsed. "But I mean you no harm. You understand? No harm." He kept his hands visible, kept his body language open and non-threatening, and slowly, carefully, backed further away until he was pressed against the far wall, as far from her as the cabin's dimensions would permit. The young woman watched him with the intensity of a trapped animal, her whole body tense beneath the blankets, ready to bolt despite the fact that she could barely sit upright. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Then her eyes moved past him, landing on the shelf above the table, on the daguerreotype in its simple frame. Elijah saw her expression shift, some of the raw panic draining away as she studied the photograph of Sarah and Thomas. Her gaze came back to him, and he saw her making calculations, piecing together information. A man alone, a photograph of a lost family, a cabin in the wilderness far from settlements. She was reading him the same way he had read her tracks in the snow. "My name," he said slowly, "is Elijah. Elijah McAllister." She watched him for another moment, then seemed to come to some internal decision. Her hand moved to her chest, fingers splaying across the blanket. "Ayita," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ayita," Elijah repeated, committing the name to memory. "That's good. That's real good." He moved slowly to the table and picked up the tin cup he had been using to give her water, then set it down on the floor and slid it across to her, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Water," he said. "You need to drink." Ayita looked at the cup, then back at him, her suspicions still evident, but tempered now by the reality of her situation. She was in his cabin, wearing his blankets, weak as a kitten from cold and injury and blood loss. If he meant her harm, there was little she could do to prevent it, and they both knew it. She reached for the cup with a trembling hand and raised it to her lips, drinking in small, careful sips. When she had emptied it, she set it down and pulled the blankets more tightly around herself, her eyes never leaving his face. "Where?" she began, then stopped, searching for words. Her English was halting, but present. "Where is this place?" "Northern Wyoming," Elijah said. "About 2 days' ride from Fort Robinson, 3 days from any settlement. You're safe here. The storm will keep anyone from finding us for at least a few days." Something in his phrasing made her eyes widen slightly. "Anyone?" she repeated. "Whoever you were running from," Elijah said quietly. "I saw the tracks. I saw the blood. Someone hurt you and you ran." "That about right?" Ada's face closed down, her expression going carefully blank in a way that told him everything he needed to know. She had secrets, and those secrets involved violence and fear. "I won't ask you to tell me until you're ready," he continued. "But I want you to know that while you're under this roof, you're under my protection. Old habits from my cavalry days. A man doesn't abandon someone in need." She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for deception or hidden intent. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal requirement because her shoulders dropped slightly, losing some of their rigid tension. "You," she said carefully, "you help me." We. The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct and cutting straight to the heart of things. Why indeed? Why had he followed those tracks? Why had he carried her back through a blizzard? Why had he spent the afternoon nursing a complete stranger back from the edge of death when he had spent 4 years avoiding all human contact? Elijah looked at the photograph of Sarah and Thomas, at the faces that haunted his mornings and his evenings and all the hours in between. "Because I couldn't help my own family," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Maybe I can help you." He saw understanding flash across Aita's face, a recognition of shared pain. She glanced at the photograph again, and when she looked back at him, her expression had softened. "They," she said, gesturing at the daguerreotype, "gone. 4 years now," Elijah confirmed. "Plague took them while I was away on duty. By the time I got back, my son was already buried and my wife was dying." "I am sorry," Aita said, and the simple sincerity in her voice nearly undid him. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak for a moment, then cleared his throat. "You should rest. Your ribs are badly bruised and you lost a fair amount of blood. Sleep if you can. I'll keep watch." Aita hesitated, then asked, "You sleep where?" It was a fair question. The cabin had one bed, and she was currently occupying it. "I'll take the chair," Elijah said. "Won't be the first time." "The chair," Aita repeated, looking at the simple wooden furniture with clear skepticism. "You are old man. You need bed." Despite everything, despite the weight of the day and the storm and the memories it had stirred, Elijah felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "I'm 58, not dead yet, and you need that bed more than I do." Aita continued to look uncertain, but exhaustion was clearly winning the battle against her concerns. Her eyelids were growing heavy, her body sinking deeper into the blankets. She murmured something in Apache that he didn't catch. Then her eyes drifted closed. Elijah waited until her breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep before he allowed himself to relax. He moved quietly around the cabin, checking the fire, checking the door to make sure it was secure against the storm, checking the shutters on the single window. Everything was as battened down as he could make it. He settled into the chair and stretched his bad leg out in front of him, feeling the familiar ache settle into his bones. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, the wind screaming and the snow piling higher against the walls. By morning, they would likely be half buried, and it would take hours of shoveling to clear a path to the door. But for now, they were warm and dry and alive, and that was more than Elijah had expected when he woke this morning. He looked at Aita sleeping in his bed, her face peaceful now in a way it hadn't been when conscious, and he thought about the tracks in the snow, about the blood in the torn dress, and the terror he had seen in her eyes when she first woke. Someone had hurt her. Someone had chased her into a blizzard and left her to die. And while Elijah had spent 4 years convincing himself that he was done with the world and its violence, done with protecting and defending and caring about anything beyond his own guilt and grief, he found that he couldn't quite make himself believe that lie anymore. This young woman, this Aita, had stumbled into his exile, and in doing so had cracked something open inside him that he had thought was sealed forever. As the afternoon faded into evening and the cabin grew darker despite the fire, Elijah sat in his chair and kept watch over a stranger who had somehow, in the space of a few hours, become his responsibility. His hands rested on his knees, and on his left hand the gold band of his wedding ring caught the firelight, a reminder of vows made long ago, to honor, to protect, to cherish. He had failed Sarah. He had failed Thomas. But sitting here now, listening to Aita breathe and watching the snow pile higher against the window, Elijah McAllister made a silent promise to the ghosts that haunted him and to the living woman who slept in his bed. He would not fail again. The storm raged through the night with a fury that seemed personal, as if the Wyoming winter had taken offense at their survival and was determined to correct its oversight. Elijah dozed fitfully in the chair, his body protesting the uncomfortable position, his mind refusing to fully surrender to sleep. Every few hours he would rise, add wood to the fire, check on Ayita's breathing, and then return to his vigil. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, the temperature inside the cabin began to drop despite the roaring fire. Elijah could see his breath forming clouds in the air, could feel the cold creeping in through invisible gaps in the walls, through the floorboards, through the very stones of the chimney. The single blanket he had wrapped around himself was insufficient against the deepening freeze, and if he was cold with all his layers of clothing, then Ayita, weakened and injured, would be in real danger. He stood and crossed to the bed, looking down at the young woman who had curled into a tight ball beneath a pile of blankets, her body instinctively trying to conserve heat. Even in sleep she was shivering, small tremors running through her frame. Elijah stood there for a long moment, weighing options and proprieties against the simple mathematics of survival. The cabin had one bed. They had limited blankets. The temperature was still dropping, and the fire could only do so much against the kind of cold that killed quietly in the night. He made his decision. "Ayita," he said softly, touching her shoulder through the blanket. "Ayita, wake up." Her eyes opened immediately, alert despite her exhaustion, and he saw the flash of fear return before she recognized him. "The temperature is dropping," Elijah said, speaking slowly and clearly. "We need to share body heat or you won't make it through the night. I know that's not proper, and I know you don't have reason to trust me, but I need you to understand that this is about survival, nothing more." Ayita blinked at him, processing his words, and he could see her mind working through the implications, the risk assessment, the lack of alternatives. "I'll stay on top of the blankets," he continued. "You stay under them. There will be wool between us. I'm an old man, Ayita. I've been married. I know how to keep my honor and keep you warm, but I won't do this unless you agree." She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching at his face in the firelight, and then she nodded once, a small, sharp movement of her chin. "You," she said quietly, "like father, I trust." The words hit Elijah harder than he expected, a recognition of something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. He was old enough to be her father. Hell, if Thomas had lived, he might have had a daughter near Ayita's age by now. The thought was both painful and oddly comforting. "Thank you," he said simply. He kept his word. He lay down on top of the blankets while Ayita remained cocooned beneath them, and he positioned himself carefully, his back to her, maintaining as much distance as a narrow bed would allow. But even through the layers of wool, he could feel the cold radiating from her body, could sense how close she still was to the edge. Slowly over the course of the next hour, their combined body heat began to warm the space beneath the blankets. Ayita's shivering gradually subsided, her breathing evened out, and despite his determination to stay awake and vigilant, Elijah felt his own exhausted body finally begin to relax. Just before sleep took him, he heard Ayita whisper something in Apache, her voice soft and already half dreaming. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. Gratitude, relief, trust. He slept better than he had in 4 years. Morning came late, the storm clouds blocking most of the sun's light, but when Elijah opened his eyes, he could tell from the quality of the darkness that dawn had passed. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, and the cabin was cold again, though not as brutally frigid as it had been at 3 in the morning. He became aware of warmth against his back, of the soft sound of breathing, and realized that during the night, Ayita had shifted closer, seeking heat in her sleep. There was still the barrier of blankets between them, but she had curled against him with the unconscious trust of someone too exhausted and cold to maintain defensive boundaries. Elijah eased himself carefully out of the bed, trying not to wake her, and set about rebuilding the fire. His leg complained bitterly about the night spent in an awkward position, and it took him longer than usual to coax the coals back to life. But eventually flames began to lick at the new wood, and warmth started to spread through the cabin once more. He was filling the coffee pot with snow water when Ayita stirred. She sat up slowly, wincing as her bruised ribs protested the movement, and pulled the blankets around herself like a shield. When she saw him by the stove, saw that he was dressed and busy with morning tasks, Some of the tension left her shoulders. "Good morning," Elijah said. "How do you feel?" Aida considered the question, taking inventory of her body. "Hurt," she said finally, "but not dying." "That's progress," Elijah replied with a small smile. "Can you eat something? I have dried venison and some cornmeal. Not fancy, but it will give you strength." She nodded, and he set about preparing a simple breakfast, heating water for corn mush, and cutting thin strips of the jerky he had made in the fall. While he worked, he was aware of Ayita watching him, studying his movements, the layout of the cabin, the routines of his solitary life. When the food was ready, he brought it to her on a tin plate, and she ate slowly, carefully, each bite an effort, but also clearly necessary. The color was returning to her face, and her hands, though still bandaged from the cut she had sustained, were steadier than they had been the night before. "Elijah," she said after she had finished eating, "you teach me English better? I want to speak, to understand." "I can do that," he agreed. "Might help pass the time while we wait for the storm to break." And so they began. Elijah pointed to objects around the cabin, naming them clearly, and Aida repeated the words, her tongue working around unfamiliar sounds. Stove, table, chair, cup, blanket, rifle. She was a quick study, picking up pronunciation with remarkable speed, and when he moved on to more complex phrases, she absorbed them with the focused intensity of someone who understood that language could mean the difference between safety and danger. Between lessons, Elijah found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He told her about his time in the cavalry, about learning to track and scout in terrain that wanted to kill you if you made a single mistake. He told her about the campaigns in the Dakotas, though he kept the details vague, aware that her people might well have been on the receiving end of those campaigns. And she, in turn, began to share pieces of her own story. Her English was improving rapidly, and though she still struggled with complex sentences, she managed to convey the essential facts. Her parents were dead, both lost to sickness when she was younger. She had been raised by her uncle, Chief Nathan, who had taught her healing herbs, tanning hides, the traditional skills of her people. But when Elijah asked about how she came to be running through a blizzard with torn clothes and fresh wounds, her expression closed down, and she looked away. "Not ready," she said quietly. "Not yet." "That's all right," Elijah told her. "When you're ready, I'll listen. Until then, you're safe here." 3 days passed in this way. The storm continued its assault, piling snow against the cabin walls until Elijah had to dig out the door each morning just to keep it from being completely sealed. Inside, they fell into a rhythm. Elijah would wake early, rebuild the fire, prepare food. Aida, growing stronger each day, began to help with small tasks, insisting despite his protests that she needed to move, to work, to feel useful. He taught her how to read the sky through the cabin's single window, how to judge the severity of a storm by the way the wind sounded against the walls. She taught him a few words of Apache, laughing at his pronunciation, the sound of her laughter strange and welcome in a cabin that had known only silence for so long. On the third evening, as they sat by the fire after a simple dinner of rabbit stew, Aida finally spoke about what had driven her into the storm. "2 weeks ago," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "men came to our camp, 3 men on horses. Their leader was named Garrett Moss." Elijah listened without interrupting as the story spilled out of her. How Garrett and his men had demanded supplies, horses, anything of value. How Chief Nathan had refused, knowing that giving in to such demands would only invite more violence. How Garrett had responded by setting fire to the tents. How the camp had erupted into chaos. Women screaming, children crying, men trying to fight back against the guns with only knives and bows. "They took women," Aida said, her hands clenched in her lap. "My cousin Kaya, they grabbed her. I tried to stop them. I had small knife for cutting herbs, and when Garrett grabbed me, I stabbed him. Here." She touched her side, indicating where the blade had gone in. "There was much blood. He let me go, was screaming, and I ran. I ran into the night, and I heard them behind me, heard horses, heard Garrett shouting my name. He knew me. He wanted me, specifically, for revenge." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and Elijah saw the shine of tears in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I ran for 2 days," she continued. "I didn't stop. Didn't sleep. I heard them behind me sometimes. But the storm was coming, and I thought maybe the storm would hide me. Then I fell, under the tree, and I thought that was the end. I thought I would die alone in the snow, and no one would ever know what happened to me. She looked at him then, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears and something fiercer than grief. But you found me, she said. You saved me when you didn't have to, when you didn't even know me. Why, Elijah? Why did you care? The question from the first night, asked again, but with more weight now, more understanding of what his choice had cost him in terms of the isolation he had built so carefully. Elijah looked at the photograph on the shelf, at Sarah's kind face and Thomas's gap-toothed smile. I told you I was away when they died, he said slowly. What I didn't tell you was that I knew they were sick. Sarah sent me a letter, said Thomas had a fever and she was worried. I asked my commanding officer for leave, and he said no, said the mission was too important, that I needed to stay. He paused, the old anger and guilt rising in his throat like bile. I stayed, he continued. I followed orders. I did my duty. And while I was mapping territory that didn't matter to anyone, my son died. By the time I got the telegram, by the time I rode home, Thomas was already in the ground and Sarah was dying. Aida reached out and placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort that he hadn't expected and didn't deserve but accepted anyway. She asked me if Thomas was safe, Elijah said, his voice rough. She was delirious with fever. Didn't know he was already gone. And I lied to her. I told her yes, he was sleeping, he was safe, because I couldn't bear to tell her the truth. I let my wife die believing a lie because I wasn't strong enough to give her the truth. The tears he had been holding back for 4 years finally broke free, running down his weathered cheeks, and he didn't try to stop them. A father is supposed to protect his children, he said. A husband is supposed to be there when his wife needs him. I failed at both, so when I saw your tracks in the snow, when I realized someone was out there dying alone, I couldn't walk away. Because maybe I couldn't save my family, but maybe I could save you. Maybe that could count for something. Aida's grip on his hand tightened, and when he finally looked at her, he saw tears on her face too, but also something else. Understanding, forgiveness, connection. You are a good man, Elijah, she said firmly. What happened to your family? Not your fault. You did duty, you tried. The sickness, that not something you could fight. A father should have been there, Elijah whispered. A father does his best, Aida countered. Your son, he knew you loved him. Your wife, she died believing he was safe and you were with her. That is mercy, not lie. That is love. The absolution in her words coming from this young woman who had lost her own parents, who had seen her own people burned and scattered, was unexpected and overwhelming. Elijah closed his eyes and let the tears fall, let the grief he had carried in silence for 4 years finally find voice. Aida moved closer and rested her head against his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of shared pain, of two broken people finding comfort in each other's presence. They sat that way for a long time while the fire burned down and the storm continued its endless assault on the cabin walls. On the 4th morning, Elijah woke to silence. The wind had stopped. The constant howl that had become background noise over the past days was simply gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost unnatural. He rose carefully, not wanting to wake Aida, who had taken to sleeping more peacefully now that her ribs were beginning to heal. He pulled on his coat and boots and went to the door, having to put his shoulder against it to force it open against the drift that had piled up overnight. The world outside was transformed. Snow covered everything in a blanket of white that sparkled in the weak morning sun, smooth and undisturbed except for the path Elijah had shoveled the day before, which was now filled in completely. The trees sagged under the weight of ice and snow, their branches bent into new shapes. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that only comes after a major storm, when even the birds haven't yet ventured out to test the new landscape. Elijah stepped outside and began the work of clearing the door, his breath forming clouds in air so cold it burned his lungs. As he worked, his mind was already moving through the list of tasks that the storm's end would bring. Check the lean-to where he kept his supplies. Make sure the roof hadn't collapsed. Check the trap line. Reset the snares that would have been buried. gather more wood, because even though the storm had passed, winter was far from over. He was halfway through clearing the path when something caught his eye. Fresh tracks in the snow, leading from the tree line toward the cabin before veering away again. Not animal tracks, boot prints. Elijah straightened, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. The tracks were relatively fresh, made since the snow had stopped falling, which meant within the last few hours. Someone had approached the cabin during the night, had come close enough to see smoke from the chimney, and then had deliberately turned away. He followed the tracks with his eyes, noting the pattern, the spacing. A single person, moving carefully, pausing frequently. The stride length was shorter than his own, suggesting someone smaller or someone moving cautiously. The prince led back into the forest, disappearing into the dense growth of pine and aspen. Elijah returned to the cabin and found Aida awake, sitting up in bed with the blankets wrapped around her shoulders. "Someone was here," he said without preamble. "During the night. They came close to the cabin and then left." Fear flashed across Aida's face. "Garrett?" "I don't know," Elijah admitted. "The tracks are too small to be a full-grown man's, but that doesn't mean much. Could be one of his men. Could be a scout checking to see if anyone lives here." "What do we do?" Aida asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We prepare," Elijah said, "and we wait. Whoever it was didn't attack, which means they're either not ready or they're not sure what they're dealing with. That gives us time." He moved to the wall where his rifle hung and took it down, checking the action, making sure it was loaded and ready. Then he pulled out a second pistol from the chest at the foot of the bed, an old Navy Colt that had belonged to a fellow soldier who died in a skirmish back in '76. "Have you ever fired a gun?" he asked Aida. She shook her head. "Then you're going to learn," Elijah said. "Because if whoever had made those tracks comes back, I need to know you can defend yourself." They spent the rest of the morning in weapons training. Elijah showed Aida how to hold the pistol, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. He had her practice the motions over and over without ammunition, building muscle memory, teaching her body to understand the weight and balance of the weapon. In a fight, he told her, you won't have time to think. Your body has to know what to do without your mind getting in the way. That's why we train. Aida absorbed the lessons with the same focused intensity she had brought to learning English, and Elijah found himself impressed by her quick grasp of concepts, her willingness to repeat actions until they became smooth and automatic. "You learn fast," he commented. "My people, we learn fast or we die," Aida replied simply. "World does not wait for slow learners." As the afternoon wore on, Elijah ventured out to check his trapline, leaving Aida in the cabin with the loaded pistol and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone but him. He moved through the snow-covered forest with the quiet efficiency of his cavalry training, eyes constantly scanning for signs of disturbance, for tracks, for anything out of place. He found 2 of his snares had been triggered, but whatever had been caught was gone, pulled free by force. The wire was bent and damaged, useless now. And near the 3rd trap, he found more boot prints, the same size as the ones near the cabin. Whoever was out here, they were following him, watching his movements, learning his patterns. Elijah returned to the weapon as the sun was beginning to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink. He barred the door and checked the shutters, making sure everything was secure. "We have a watcher," he told Aida. "Someone who knows these woods. Someone who's tracking my movements. They're not attacking, not yet, but they're gathering information." "What do they want?" Aida asked. "That's the question, isn't it?" Elijah settled into the chair and began cleaning his rifle, a ritual that helped him think. Could be they're working for Garrett, scouting ahead before bringing the main force. Could be a trapper who's curious about smoke from a cabin he thought was abandoned. Could be someone who needs help but is too afraid to ask for it. That night, Elijah suggested they take turns keeping watch. He would sleep for 4 hours while Aida sat by the window, then they would switch. It wasn't ideal, both of them needed more rest than that, but until they knew who was out there and what they wanted, vigilance seemed more important than comfort. Aida's watch passed without incident. When she woke Elijah at midnight, she reported seeing nothing, hearing nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest settling into its winter rhythms. But during Elijah's watch, sometime around 2 in the morning, He saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure stood between two pine trees, barely visible in the starlight reflecting off the snow. Not moving, just standing, watching the cabin. Elijah's hand tightened on his rifle, but he didn't raise it, didn't make any aggressive moves. He simply watched back, and after several long minutes, the figure turned and melted back into the forest. When dawn came, Elijah found himself torn between going out to confront whoever was watching them and staying to defend the cabin. In the end, practical considerations won out. The cabin was defensible. The forest was full of ambush points. Better to let the watcher come to them on ground they controlled. But the waiting was hard, especially with Aida growing more anxious with each passing hour. On the sixth morning after Elijah had found Aida in the snow, the situation resolved itself in a way neither of them had expected. A knock on the door, not pounding, not aggressive, just three clear knocks, and then a voice, young and uncertain. "Please," the voice called. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm lost, and I'm cold, and I need help." Elijah moved to the door, rifle ready, and called back, "Step away from the door where I can see you through the window." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps in snow. A figure moved into view, and Elijah felt his grip on the rifle loosen slightly. It was a boy, 14, maybe 15 years old, wearing clothes that had once been good quality but were now torn and dirty, his face pinched with cold and hunger. Elijah opened the door, the rifle still in his hands but pointed at the ground now, and the boy looked up at him with eyes that held equal parts hope and fear. "My name is Daniel," the boy said, his teeth chattering. "Daniel Morgan. My parents died 3 weeks ago from influenza, and I've been trying to reach my uncle's place at Carson's Ridge, but I got lost in the storm. I saw your smoke 2 days ago, but I was afraid to approach because I didn't know if you were friendly or not." "You've been watching us," Elijah said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded, looking ashamed. "Yes, sir, I'm sorry. I just needed to be sure before I came closer." Elijah studied the boy, noting the hollows in his cheeks that spoke of missed meals, the way he swayed slightly from exhaustion, the desperate hope in his eyes. He saw Thomas in that face, saw what his son might have become if he had lived long enough to grow into adolescence. "Come inside," Elijah said, stepping back, "before you freeze to death out there." Daniel stumbled across the threshold, and Aida, who had been standing ready with the pistol, lowered it and moved to help the boy to a chair near the fire. He practically collapsed into it, his whole body shaking with cold and relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much." Elijah barred the door and set his rifle aside, then set about preparing hot food and water. As Daniel thawed out and began to eat with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, the full story emerged. His parents had run a small trading post near the South Pass. When the influenza had swept through, it had taken both of them within days of each other. Daniel had buried them himself, then set out to reach his uncle, the only other family he had. But the winter had caught him unprepared. The storm had turned him around, and he had been wandering, lost and frightened, when he stumbled across Elijah's cabin. "I thought I was going to die," Daniel said quietly, "just like Ma and Pa." "You're safe now," Elijah told him, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "You can stay here until the weather clears enough to travel. Then we'll figure out how to get you to your uncle." Daniel looked at him with such profound gratitude that Elijah had to look away, uncomfortable with the weight of the boy's trust. Over the next few days, a new dynamic established itself in the cabin. Daniel proved to be a hard worker, eager to help with any task, desperate to earn his keep. Elijah found himself teaching the boy the same skills he had once taught Thomas, showing him how to chop wood efficiently, how to set snares, how to read animal tracks in the snow. Aida, for her part, took on a sisterly role, mending Daniel's torn clothes, making sure he ate enough, teasing him gently when he struggled with tasks. The sound of her laughter, of Daniel's responding chuckle, transformed the cabin from a place of solitary penance into something that felt almost like a home. One evening, as the three of them sat around the fire after dinner, Daniel looked at Elijah and asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Mr. Elijah, do you miss your son, the boy in the picture?" The directness of the question caught Elijah off guard, but he saw no judgment in Daniel's eyes, only genuine curiosity and something that might have been fellow feeling. "Every day," Elijah admitted. every single day. I miss my pa too, Daniel said quietly. Do you think they watch us? The people we've lost? Elijah looked at the photograph on the shelf, at Sarah and Thomas frozen in time, and then at the two young people sitting with him now, both of them orphaned by circumstance, both of them looking to him for answers he wasn't sure he had. I hope so, he said finally. And I hope that when they look down, they see us trying to be better, trying to honor their memory by living lives they would be proud of. Aida reached over and squeezed his hand, and Daniel nodded solemnly. And in that moment, Elijah felt something shift inside him, some long frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw. For the first time in 4 years, the cabin held more than one person. For the first time in 4 years, there was laughter and conversation and the simple warmth of human connection. And while Elijah knew that danger still lurked beyond his walls, that Garrett Moss might still be hunting Aida, that the world remained a hard and unforgiving place, he also knew that he was no longer facing it alone. That night after Aida and Daniel had fallen asleep, Elijah stood at the window looking out at the moonlit snow. The forest was quiet, peaceful, beautiful in its winter stillness. But somewhere out there, he knew, forces were moving that would test everything he had built over the past week, everything he had rediscovered about himself. The tracks in the snow had brought him Daniel. But other tracks, older and more dangerous, had brought Aida. And sooner or later, those two paths would intersect in ways he couldn't yet predict. Elijah touched the window glass, feeling the cold radiating through, and made a silent promise to the family he had lost and the family he was building. This time he would be there. This time he would not fail. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Over the next few days, a new dynamic established itself in the cabin, transforming the space in ways that Elijah hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure he was ready for. Daniel proved to be a hard worker, eager to help with any task, desperate to earn his keep and justify the shelter and food that had been given to him. The boy rose before dawn each morning, rebuilding the fire before Elijah woke, fetching water, organizing the firewood pile with a precision that spoke of someone who had been taught to value order and efficiency. Elijah found himself teaching the boy the same skills he had once taught Thomas, showing him how to chop wood efficiently, how to set snares for small game, how to read animal tracks in the snow. Daniel absorbed the lessons with intense focus, asking questions that showed he was thinking beyond the immediate task to the underlying principles, trying to understand not just what to do, but why it worked. My pa used to say, Daniel remarked one afternoon as they checked the trap line together, that a man who understands why is worth 10 men who only know how. Your pa was a wise man, Elijah replied, studying the way Daniel examined a rabbit track, the boy's eyes following the trail with growing confidence. He was, Daniel said quietly. Wish I'd told him that more often while I had the chance. The regret in those words was something Elijah understood all too well, and he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that needed no verbal explanation. Aida, for her part, took on a sisterly role with Daniel, mending his torn clothes with careful stitches, making sure he ate enough at every meal, teasing him gently when he struggled with tasks that required more finesse than strength. The sound of her laughter, of Daniel's responding chuckle, transformed the cabin from a place of solitary penance into something that felt alive, vibrant, almost normal. One evening, as the three of them sat around the fire after dinner, Daniel shared more about his journey, about the terrifying nights alone in the forest, about the moment when he had almost given up hope entirely. There was this one night, he said, staring into the flames, when I couldn't feel my feet anymore, and I was so tired I just wanted to lie down in the snow and sleep. I thought about Ma and Pa, about how they must have felt at the end, and I thought maybe it wouldn't be so bad to join them. Maybe that was just how things were meant to be. What changed your mind? Aida asked softly. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, I remembered something Pa told me the day before he died. He was burning up with fever, could barely talk, but he grabbed my hand and said, Daniel, you survive. You hear me? You serve and you live a good life, and you make sure we weren't your whole story. So I got up, and I kept walking. Elijah felt his throat tighten at the boy's words, at the way they echoed his own journey from despair towards something that might eventually become hope. Your father would be proud of you, he said. Takes more courage to keep walking than it does to lie down. Well, Mr. Elijah, Daniel said, looking at him with an expression that held both hesitation and determination. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you think, Daniel began carefully, that the people we lose, they'd want us to stop living? To just exist instead of really being alive? The question hung in the air between them, and Elijah found himself thinking about Sarah, about Thomas, about the 4 years he had spent in this cabin, convincing himself that isolation was somehow honoring their memory. No, he said finally, I don't think they would. I think they'd want us to live fully, to find joy where we can, to build something good from what's left. Then why, Daniel asked with the brutal honesty of youth, have you been living alone out here for 4 years? Aida glanced at Elijah, concerned about how he would respond to such a direct challenge. But Elijah found himself smiling slightly, appreciating the boy's courage in asking what others might have been too polite to voice. Because, he said slowly, sometimes it takes a while to hear what the dead are really trying to tell us. Sometimes we get so caught up in guilt that we forget about grace. And sometimes, he looked at both Aida and Daniel, we need the living to remind us that we're still here for a reason. That night, after the others had fallen asleep, Elijah sat by the window keeping watch, his mind turning over the changes that had transformed his carefully constructed solitude. 6 days ago he had been alone, had expected to remain alone, had built his entire existence around the concept of isolation as penance. Now his cabin held 3 people, an Apache woman fleeing violence, a 14-year-old boy orphaned by disease, and himself a 58-year-old former cavalry scout who was beginning to suspect that his 4 years of exile had been less about honoring the dead and more about avoiding the terrifying possibility of caring about the living. He was pulled from his thoughts by movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure on horseback, visible for just a moment in the moonlight before disappearing back into the trees. Too distant to make out details, but the silhouette suggested someone big, someone confident, someone who wasn't trying particularly hard to remain hidden. Elijah's hand tightened on his rifle, and he spent the rest of the night alert and watching, but the figure didn't reappear. The next morning, as he stepped outside to check the perimeter, he found fresh horse tracks circling the cabin at a distance of about 50 yards. Multiple sets, at least 3 horses, possibly 4. The tracks were deliberate, methodical, someone surveying the cabin, counting chimneys, noting the lean-to, gathering information. When he returned inside, both Aida and Daniel were awake, their faces showing they had read the tension in his posture the moment he walked through the door. They're here, Aida said, and it wasn't a question. Someone's here, Elijah corrected. Could be Garrett's people, could be trappers, could be anyone, but yes, we had visitors last night. Daniel's face had gone pale. How many? At least 3, maybe 4 riders. They circled the cabin, kept their distance, rode out before dawn. What do we do? The boy asked, trying to keep his voice steady but not quite managing it. Elijah looked at both of them, these 2 young people who had stumbled into his exile and forced him to remember what it meant to care about someone beyond himself. We prepare, he said. We fortify what we can, we plan for the worst, and we hope for the best. Daniel, you're going to learn to shoot. Aida, you're going to practice until you can reload that pistol in the dark. And I'm going to make sure that anyone who comes at this cabin with bad intentions regrets it. They spent the morning reinforcing their defenses. Elijah showed them how to stack firewood against the windows to create makeshift barriers that would slow anyone trying to break in. He positioned his spare rifle where it could be reached quickly from multiple points in the cabin. He filled every container with water in case they ended up trapped inside for an extended period. Daniel proved to be a quick study with the rifle, his hands steady despite his nervousness, his eye good despite his lack of experience. Elijah taught him the basics, focusing on the fundamentals that would matter in a close-range fight rather than precision shooting that required years to master. You don't need to be a marksman, Elijah told him. You just need to be able to put rounds on target at 20 yards. Aim for the center of the chest. Don't try to be fancy. Simple and effective beats complicated every time. As the afternoon wore on, Elijah made a decision he had been avoiding. He needed more information, needed to know who was out there and what they wanted. Waiting blindly for an attack was a recipe for disaster. I'm going out, he announced. Going to follow those tracks, see where they lead. No, Aida said immediately, fear sharp in her voice. Too dangerous. They could be waiting. Which is why I need to know, Elijah replied gently. If we wait for them to come to us on their schedule, we lose the initiative. Better to gather intelligence now while we can. Then I come with you, she insisted. No, you and Daniel stay here. Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll be back before dark. He could see her struggling with the urge to argue further, but finally she nodded, understanding the logic even if she hated the risk. Elijah armed himself with both rifle and pistol, filled his pockets with extra ammunition, and set out following the horse tracks. They led northeast, away from the cabin, and deeper into the rough country that bordered the foothills. The riders had moved with confidence, not bothering to hide their trail, which suggested either arrogance or the certainty that they had nothing to fear from whoever occupied the cabin. He followed the tracks for about 2 miles until they converged with another set of prints, these ones coming from the east. 6 horses total now, all heading toward a location about another mile ahead where the forest thinned and a natural clearing offered space for a camp. Elijah approached the clearing with extreme caution, using every skill he had learned in 30 years of scouting, moving from cover to cover, pausing frequently to listen and observe. The smell of wood smoke reached him first, then the low murmur of voices, then finally the visual confirmation of what he had suspected. A camp. 6 men. Rough-looking characters with the casual violence of those who had lived outside the law long enough to forget why laws existed in the first place. They sat around a fire, passing a bottle between them, their horses picketed nearby. And standing apart from the others, his back to a tree and his hand pressed against his side where bandages were visible beneath his open coat, was a man who matched Aida's description perfectly. Big, brutal-faced, with eyes that held the kind of mean intelligence that made him more dangerous than simple violence ever could. Garrett Moss. Elijah watched them from concealment, counting weapons, noting the layout of the camp, listening to fragments of conversation carried on the cold air. Cabin's occupied, that's for sure, one man was saying. Saw smoke, saw movement. How many? Garrett's voice was rough, pain evident in the way he held himself. Can't say for certain. At least 2, maybe more. Saw an old man chopping wood. Old man, Garrett repeated, and there was contempt in his voice. Probably some hermit, won't be a problem. What about the girl? Another man asked. You sure she's even there? She's there, Garrett said with absolute certainty. Where else would she go? She stabbed me and ran into a blizzard. She got lucky, found shelter. But her luck just ran out. When do we move? Garrett was silent for a moment, thinking. Tomorrow, early morning, just before dawn. The old man will be asleep, guard down. We go in fast, take whoever's there, burn it if we have to. I want that Apache bitch alive. She owes me blood. Elijah had heard enough. He withdrew as carefully as he had approached, not allowing himself to hurry despite the urgency screaming in his mind. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to discovery, and discovery would mean a fight he wasn't ready for. The journey back to the cabin seemed to take forever, every minute an agony of imagined scenarios, of things that could go wrong, of the 100 ways this could end in blood and loss. He had found something in this cabin, had rediscovered parts of himself he thought were dead, and the thought of Garrett Moss and his men destroying that was unacceptable. When he finally reached the cabin and gave the signal knock, when Aida threw open the door and he saw the relief flood her face, he allowed himself one moment of gratitude before shifting into tactical mode. They're camped 2 miles northeast, he reported, barring the door behind him. 6 men total, including Garrett. They're planning to attack at dawn tomorrow. The color drained from Aida's face, but she didn't collapse, didn't give in to the fear. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and asked, What do we do? We have 2 choices, Elijah said. We can run, try to reach Fort Robinson before they catch us, or we stay and defend. How far to Fort Robinson? Daniel asked. 2 days on horseback in good weather, 4 days on foot in this snow, and that's assuming we don't get lost, don't get caught, don't freeze. They have horses, Aida pointed out. We don't. They catch us easy. Elijah nodded. which means running is a trap. We'd be exposed, vulnerable, easy targets in the open. Here, we have walls, we have cover, we have the advantage of defense. 6 against 3, Daniel said quietly, and I barely know how to shoot. 6 against 3, Elijah agreed, but they don't know what they're walking into. They think I'm just some old hermit. They don't know I'm cavalry trained. They don't know we're expecting them. Surprise can be a force multiplier. He looked at both of them, at Aida with her jaw set in determination despite the fear in her eyes, at Daniel trying so hard to be brave despite being terrified. I won't lie to you, he said. This is going to be dangerous. People could die, probably will die. If you want to run, if you want to take your chances in the forest, I'll understand. I'll even help you prepare, give you supplies, show you the best route. But if you stay, if you fight, I need to know you're committed, because halfway measures will get us all killed. I stay, Aida said immediately. Garrett, he will not stop until I am dead, or he is dead. Running only delays. Better to end it here now with you beside me. Daniel took a little longer to answer, his young face working through fear and doubt, and the terrible weight of a decision that shouldn't have fallen on someone his age. Finally, he nodded. My pa didn't raise a coward, he said, his voice stronger than Elijah expected. I stay too. All right then, Elijah said. Then we prepare, and we make sure that when Garrett Moss comes for us, he finds more than he bargained for. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, transforming the cabin into something approximating a defensible position. Elijah showed them how to create firing ports by moving furniture, how to arrange their limited ammunition for quick reloading, how to prepare escape routes in case the cabin became untenable. He taught them the basics of combat tactics, explaining fields of fire, overlapping coverage, the importance of communication during a fight. When the shooting starts, he told them, it's going to be chaos, noise, smoke, fear. You're going to want to panic, to run, to freeze. Don't. Focus on your task. Daniel, you're on the window facing north. That's your responsibility. That's your sector. Aida, you're on the east window. I'll cover the door in the south approach. We each hold our position unless I say otherwise. As night fell, they ate a quiet dinner, none of them with much appetite, but all of them understanding the need to maintain strength. The cabin felt smaller than it had before, the walls that had seemed so solid now feeling thin and inadequate against what was coming. Tell me about the cavalry, Daniel said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. What was it like? Elijah considered the question, understanding what the boy was really asking. Not what was it like, but how did you survive when you were scared? How did you face death and not break? It was hard, he said honestly. A lot of good men died. A lot of bad things happened, but we had each other. That made the difference. When you know the person next to you will stand, will fight, will die beside you if it comes to that, it makes you stronger than you could ever be alone. Were you scared? Daniel asked. Every time, Elijah admitted. Fear is what keeps you alive. It's what makes you careful, makes you think. The men who weren't scared, who thought they were invincible, those were the ones who got killed doing something stupid. How did you deal with it? The fear? Focused on the task, on doing my job, on protecting the men around me. When you have something to fight for beyond yourself, it makes the fear manageable. He looked at both of them, at these two people who had become, against all his intentions, people he would fight for, people he would die for if necessary. Tomorrow, he said quietly, when they come, I need you both to remember something. We're not fighting for glory or revenge or anything noble. We're fighting to survive, to protect each other, to make sure that when the sun sets tomorrow, we're still here to see it. That's all that matters. Aida reached across the table and took his hand, and Daniel placed his hand on top of theirs, three people bound together by circumstance and choice, by shared danger and shared determination. We will survive, Aida said firmly. We must, because I am not ready to die, and I think you are not ready either, old man. Elijah smiled despite the tension. No, he agreed, I'm not ready, not anymore. They tried to sleep in shifts, but none of them managed much rest. Elijah dozed fitfully in the chair, his hand never far from his rifle, his mind running through scenarios and contingencies. Aida curled on the bed, her eyes open more often than closed, the pistol under her pillow. Daniel lay on a makeshift pallet by the stove, starting awake at every small sound. The night seemed endless, minutes stretching into hours, and Elijah found himself thinking about Sarah and Thomas, about the life he had lost and the life he was fighting to preserve. He thought about the choices that had brought him to this moment, about the tracks in the snow that had changed everything. An hour before dawn, he rose and woke the others. "It's time," he said simply. They took their positions in silence, each of them checking their weapons one final time, each of them trying to steady their breathing, to calm their racing hearts. Elijah positioned himself near the door where he could see the main approach, his rifle ready, his pistol within easy reach. The waiting was the worst part. Knowing they were coming but not knowing exactly when, straining to hear the first sound of approach over the pounding of blood in his ears. Dawn began to gray the eastern sky, turning the world from black to deep blue to pale light. And in that pale light, Elijah saw them coming. 6 riders spread out in a loose line, approaching from multiple angles to divide any defensive fire. They were perhaps 200 yards out when Elijah first spotted them, close enough that he could make out Garrett in the center, bigger than the others, moving with the confidence of someone who expected easy victory. "Here they come," Elijah called softly. "Remember, wait for my signal. Don't fire until I do." The riders closed to 100 yards, 50 yards. They were slowing now, becoming more cautious as they approached, beginning to realize that the cabin was silent, too silent, that something might be wrong. At 30 yards, Garrett held up his hand and the riders stopped. He stood in his stirrups, studying the cabin, his tactical sense clearly warning him that this felt like a trap. "You in the cabin," he called out. "Send out the Apache girl and we'll leave peaceful. No need for anyone else to die." Elijah didn't respond, just kept his rifle trained on Garrett's center mass, waiting for the right moment. "Last chance," Garrett shouted. "Send her out or we come in and take her." Still Elijah waited, his breathing calm, his hands steady, decades of training overriding the adrenaline that wanted to make him rush. Garrett made a gesture and 3 of his men dismounted, beginning to advance on foot toward the cabin. They moved in a spread formation, experienced enough to know not to bunch up, making themselves harder targets. When they were 20 yards from the door, Elijah made his decision. "Now," he said quietly, and fired. His shot took the lead man in the chest, dropping him instantly. Daniel's rifle cracked from the north window, the shot going wide but close enough to make the other approaching men dive for cover. Aida fired from the east, her shot hitting one of the mounted riders in the shoulder and causing him to fall from his horse with a scream. The morning erupted into chaos. Return fire hammered into the cabin walls, bullets punching through wood and sending splinters flying. Elijah worked his rifle's lever action, firing methodically at targets of opportunity, trying to keep the attackers pinned down and unable to coordinate their assault. One of Garrett's men tried to rush the door, and Elijah shot him twice, center mass, watching him crumple. Another attempted to circle around to the lean-to, and Daniel's rifle spoke again, this time finding its target, the man going down clutching his leg. But there were still 4 of them capable of fighting, and Elijah could hear them calling to each other, coordinating, preparing for a concentrated push that would overwhelm the cabin's defenders through sheer numbers and firepower. "They're going to rush us," Elijah called out. "When they do, fire as fast as you can. Don't worry about accuracy, just put rounds down range." The rush came from 2 directions simultaneously, 2 men charging the door, while Garrett and another man laid down covering fire. Elijah shot the first man through the door, but the second one was right behind him, too close for the rifle, and Elijah dropped it and drew his pistol, firing 3 times at point-blank range. The man fell backward, but his momentum carried him into the cabin, and suddenly there was a body on the floor, and Garrett himself was in the doorway, a massive figure silhouetted against the morning light, his pistol coming up. Elijah fired, but his shot went wide as he dove to the side. Garrett's return fire splintering the chair where he had been standing a moment before. They were both on the floor now, both scrambling for position, both firing wildly in the confined space. A bullet creased Elijah's upper arm, a line of fire that he barely registered. His next shot caught Garrett in the thigh, and the big man roared in pain and rage, falling against the door frame, but not going down, impossibly tough, driven by hatred and the momentum of violence. From the east window, Aida was firing at the last man outside, keeping him pinned behind a tree, unable to help his boss. Daniel had left his position and was moving toward the fight at the door, his young face set with determination, despite the terror in his eyes. Garrett lunged at Elijah despite his wounded leg, closing the distance in a stumbling rush. Too close now for guns, his hands reaching for Elijah's throat with the clear intention of strangling the life out of him. They crashed together, Elijah's bad leg buckling under the impact, both men falling. Garrett's weight was crushing, his hands finding Elijah's throat and squeezing. Elijah drove his knee into Garrett's wounded side, into the place where Aida's knife had gone in weeks before, and felt the grip loosen slightly as Garrett gasped in pain. But the man was strong, incredibly strong, and injured or not, he was younger than Elijah by 20 years, and the hands around Elijah's throat were squeezing tighter, cutting off air, and black spots were beginning to dance in Elijah's vision. He felt himself weakening, felt his strength draining away, felt the terrifying approach of unconsciousness that would mean death. His hand scrabbled uselessly for a weapon, for anything, finding nothing but empty floor. And then Daniel was there, the boy's face appearing above Garrett's shoulder, and Elijah saw him raise something, saw the fire poker from beside the stove arc down with all the strength a terrified 14-year-old could muster. The iron struck Garrett across the temple with a sound like a hammer on a melon, and the big man's grip loosened, his eyes unfocusing. Daniel hit him again and again, until Garrett rolled off Elijah and lay stunned on the floor, blood running from his scalp. Elijah gasped for air, his throat on fire, his vision still spotted with black. He saw his pistol a few feet away and lunged for it, his hand closing around the grip, bringing it up and around to where Garrett was trying to rise despite his wounds. "You threatened my family," Elijah said, his voice a rasp through his damaged throat. "That was your last mistake." He fired once, twice, 3 times, center mass, and Garrett Moss finally stopped moving, his eyes going empty, his last breath rattling out in a wheeze. From outside, a voice called out, the last surviving member of Garrett's gang. "Garrett, you okay? Talk to me." Elijah moved to the door, Daniel backing him up with the rifle reloaded and ready despite his shaking hands. Aida had her pistol trained on the window, covering their flank. "Garrett's dead," Elijah called out, "and so are most of your friends. You want to join them? Keep fighting. You want to live? Mount up and ride out. Your choice." There was a long pause, then the sound of boots running, a horse being mounted, hoofbeats rapidly receding. The last man was running, choosing life over loyalty to a dead leader. Elijah sagged against the door frame, the adrenaline that had kept him moving beginning to fade, leaving behind pain and exhaustion. His arm where the bullet had creased him was bleeding, soaking his sleeve. His throat felt crushed, every breath painful. His bad leg had given out completely and wouldn't support his weight, but they had survived. "Is it over?" Daniel asked, his voice small and scared now that the immediate danger had passed. "It's over," Elijah confirmed. Then his legs buckled, and he would have fallen if Aida hadn't been there, catching him, lowering him to the ground with surprising strength. "You're hurt," she said, her hands already checking him for wounds, her face pale but focused. "I've had worse," Elijah managed, though in truth he wasn't entirely sure that was accurate. "Check Daniel. Make sure he's not hit." "I'm okay," the boy said, setting down the rifle with shaking hands. "I'm okay, but Mr. Elijah, you're bleeding pretty bad." Aida was already tearing strips from her dress, pressing cloth against the wound on his arm. "Bullet went through," she announced. "Clean. You are lucky, old man." "Getting shot doesn't feel lucky," Elijah said, but he was smiling despite the pain, despite everything, because they were alive and whole and together. They spent the rest of the morning dealing with the aftermath. Daniel, showing a maturity beyond his years, helped to drag the bodies away from the cabin. Aida tended to Elijah's wounds with the healing knowledge her mother had taught her, cleaning and bandaging with careful attention. When Elijah tried to stand, tried to insist on helping, she pushed him back down with surprising firmness. "You rest," she commanded. "You save us. Now we save you." And Elijah, too exhausted to argue, let them care for him, let himself accept help, let himself be vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed since Sarah died. 2 days later, As Elijah was beginning to recover enough to move without his arms screaming in protest, they had another visitor. This time the approach was announced by a friendly hello from the tree line, and when Elijah called for identification, a familiar voice responded, "Samuel Pike, I come in peace, and I've got news." The old trapper rode into the clearing on a mule loaded with supplies, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw them all standing on the cabin's porch. "Heard there was trouble out this way," Samuel said, dismounting with the stiffness of age. "Came to check on you. See you handled it." "Barely," Elijah admitted. "What news do you bring?" "Good news for once," Samuel said, reaching into his saddlebag. "Got word from Fort Robinson. They've been sheltering survivors from the camp raid. Including," he looked directly at Aida, "your cousin Kaya." Aida gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Kaya lives?" "Lives and is looking for you. When I told her I knew where you might be, she asked me to bring you this." He handed over a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Aida unwrapped it with trembling hands, revealing a beaded medicine pouch that she recognized immediately. "This was my mother's," she whispered. "Kaya saved it from the fire." "She saved more than that," Samuel continued. "Saved herself and 3 other women. They're at the fort now, being cared for. She wants to see you, wants to know you're alive." "How far?" Aida asked. 2 days' ride, 4 days walking. "But," Samuel looked at Elijah's bandaged arm, at Daniel's young face, "might be you could use some help making the journey. I could guide you if you're willing." Elijah looked at Aida, saw the longing in her face, the desperate need to see her cousin, to confirm that some piece of her old life had survived. "We'll go," he said, "soon as I can sit a horse without falling off." "There's more," Samuel said. "The women who survived, they're talking about starting over. Finding a place where they can build, be safe. They're asking about land, about possibilities." An idea was forming in Elijah's mind, something that had been growing since Daniel arrived, since Aida had become more than just someone he had saved. "How much land does a man own if he has a cabin and a clearing?" he asked Samuel. "By my reckoning, if you've been living here 4 years and nobody's disputed it, you could claim about 100 acres, maybe more. Why?" "Because," Elijah said slowly, looking at the forest around them, at the mountains in the distance, at the cabin that had been his prison and was becoming his home. "Maybe there's room here for more than just me. Maybe there's room for a community, for people who need a fresh start." Aida's eyes widened with understanding. "You would do this? Share your land?" "It's not much of a life being alone," Elijah said. "I've learned that the hard way. But together, building something, protecting each other, that might be worth something." 3 weeks later, on a bright spring morning that promised the end of winter's grip, they made the journey to Fort Robinson. Elijah sat a horse with difficulty, his arms still healing but functional. Aida rode beside him, her excitement barely contained. Daniel rode behind, his young face serious with the responsibility of watching their back trail. Samuel led them along paths that avoided the worst of the remaining snow, talking constantly about the country they passed through, about the possibilities it held, about the future that might be built here if people were willing to work for it. When they reached the fort, Aida barely waited for her horse to stop before sliding off and running toward a group of women standing near the barracks. One of them, tall and strong despite the hardship she had endured, broke away from the group and ran to meet her. The 2 women collided in an embrace that spoke louder than words, both of them crying, both of them laughing, both of them alive against all odds. Elijah watched from horseback, feeling something warm and bright expanding in his chest, something he thought he had lost forever. Hope, he realized. This was what hope felt like. Daniel rode up beside him. "Mr. Elijah, do you think they'll really come? Build near the cabin?" "I don't know," Elijah said honestly, "but if they do, we'll help them. We'll build something good, something that lasts." "Like a family," Daniel said softly. "Yes," Elijah agreed, "like a family." That evening, as arrangements were being made for the women to travel to Elijah's land, as supplies were being gathered and plans were being discussed, Aida found Elijah standing alone, looking out at the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Elijah," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him, "I want to thank you for everything. for saving my life, for protecting me, for giving me hope again. You don't need to thank me, he said. You gave me back my life as surely as I saved yours. There is something else I want to say, Aita continued, her voice hesitant in a way he hadn't heard before. Something I have been thinking about. Go on. You are old man, yes, and I am young woman. This I know, but you are also good man, strong man, man who stands when others run, man who builds instead of destroys. She paused, gathering courage. Among my people, age difference does not matter so much as character, as strength, as honor. Elijah felt his heart beginning to race, understanding what she was trying to say but not quite believing it. Aita, I'm nearly 60 years old. You're in your 20s. I'm old enough to be your father. You are, she agreed, but you are not my father. You are man who saved me, man who teaches me, man who makes me feel safe for first time since my parents died. And I think, she looked up at him, her dark eyes shining in the sunset light, I think maybe you feel something too, something more than just protecting. Elijah couldn't deny it. Over the weeks since he had found her in the snow, his feelings had evolved from simple protectiveness to something deeper, something that terrified him because it felt like betrayal of Sarah's memory, even as it felt like the first real emotion he had experienced in 4 years. I do, he admitted. But Aida, I'm not the man I was. I'm broken in ways that won't heal. I failed my first family. What makes you think I won't fail again? Because, she said simply, you have already proven you will not. You chose to save me when you could have walked away. You chose to stand and fight when you could have run. You chose to build instead of hiding. That is not broken man. That is man who is healing. She reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his weathered skin. I am not asking you to forget your wife, she said. I am not asking you to replace her. I am asking you to let yourself live again, to let yourself love again. Because I think I am falling in love with you, Elijah McAllister, and I think you might be falling in love with me too, and we are both too damaged and too strong to waste this second chance. Elijah closed his eyes, feeling tears slide down his cheeks, and when he opened them again, he saw Aida looking at him with such fierce hope and determination that he couldn't help but smile. You're right, he said. I am falling in love with you. God help me, I am. Then stop fighting it, she said. Man, let it happen. Let us happen. And so he did. He let himself pull her close, let himself kiss her with all the tenderness and passion that had been locked away for 4 years, let himself feel alive and whole and desperately, terrifyingly happy. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, both smiling, Elijah said, we should do this properly. Court, I mean. Give people time to get used to the idea. How long? Aida asked, amusement in her voice. How does 6 months sound? Too long, she said firmly. 3 months. Then we marry. Then we build our life together. 3 months, Elijah agreed, knowing he would have agreed to anything she asked in that moment. 3 months later, in a clearing near the cabin that now stood surrounded by 4 other newly built dwellings, Elijah McAllister married Aida in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with the simple vows he remembered from his first marriage. Daniel stood beside him as his best man, the boy wearing new clothes and a proud smile. Kaya stood with Aida, both women wearing dresses they had made together, decorated with the intricate beadwork of their people. Samuel Pike officiated, having been appointed a magistrate by territorial authorities who were grateful to have anyone willing to provide legal services in such remote country. As Elijah slipped Sarah's wedding ring onto Aida's finger, he felt no guilt, only gratitude that Sarah had worn it for so many years, that it had survived to find another hand, another love, another chance at the happiness that had seemed impossible just months before. I promise, he said, looking into Aida's eyes, to stand beside you, to protect you, to build a life with you. For however many years I have left. I promise, Aida replied, to love you, to honor you, to remind you every day that you deserve to be happy. For however many years we have together. They kissed as husband and wife, and the small gathering of survivors and builders and people choosing hope over despair erupted in cheers. That night, as they lay together in the cabin that had been expanded to accommodate a proper bedroom, Aida rested her head on Elijah's shoulder and said softly, I am happy, husband. So am I, wife, Elijah replied, still marveling at the word, at the reality of having a wife again, of being married again, of choosing to live rather than simply exist. There is something I should tell you, Aida said, a smile in her voice. Something I learned from Kaya this morning. What's that? I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby. Elijah froze, his mind struggling to process the information. A baby, at his age. Another chance at fatherhood. Another opportunity to be there, to not fail, to protect and raise and love. Are you sure? He managed. Very sure. Kaya knows the signs. She says the baby will come in early fall, when the aspens turn gold on the mountainsides. Elijah felt tears on his face again, but this time they were tears of joy mixed with terror. Happiness mixed with the old fear that he would fail again, that he would lose again. As if reading his thoughts, Aida took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. This time will be different, Ed, she said firmly. This time you are not alone. This time we face everything together. This time, her voice softened, you get to be the father you always wanted to be, the father Thomas would want you to be. I'm scared, Elijah admitted. I'm nearly 59 years old and I'm scared of being a father again. Good, Aida said. Fear means you care. Fear means you understand how precious this is. Fear will make you careful, make you present, make you the father this child needs. She was right, he realized. The fear wasn't weakness. It was love anticipating the terrible possibility of loss. And love, real love, was always worth the risk. I love you, he said, and I love this child already, and I promise I will be here. No matter what, I will be here. I know, Aida said simply. That is why I chose you. The pregnancy progressed through the summer months, and Elijah found himself transformed from a man who had spent 4 years hiding from life into someone barely recognizable. He fretted over Aida constantly, insisting she rest more than she wanted, checking with Kaya daily about her health, driving everyone slightly crazy with his protective hovering. But he was also happy in a way he hadn't been since before the plague took Sarah and Thomas. He worked alongside the other men building more cabins, helped clear land for crops, taught Daniel and the other young people the skills they would need to survive in this country. The small settlement grew, adding new families, new buildings, new life. They named it eventually Sarah's Ridge at Elijah's suggestion, a way of honoring the woman who had loved him first and would always hold a place in his heart. Daniel thrived in the growing community, becoming something of a leader among the younger people, teaching them what Elijah had taught him, passing on knowledge with the patience of someone who understood its value. Kaya married a trapper named Robert, who had stopped at the settlement and decided to stay, drawn by the sense of community and purpose that seemed to radiate from the place. And through it all, Aida grew round with the child that represented not just new life, but redemption, second chances, the triumph of hope over despair. On a cool October evening, as the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides and the first hint of winter touched the air, Aida went into labor. Elijah paced outside the cabin while Kaya and 2 other women attended to the birth, unable to sit still, unable to think about anything except the woman he loved and the child about to enter the world. Daniel sat with him, the boy now nearly 16, tall and strong and steady in a way that made Elijah proud beyond words. She'll be fine, Daniel said. Aida is strong. I know, Elijah said, but knowing doesn't stop the fear. No, Daniel agreed, but fear means you care. Someone told me that once. Smart man. Elijah smiled despite his anxiety. Sounds like a wise teacher. The best, Daniel said simply. Hours passed, the sun set, stars appeared, and finally, just when Elijah thought he couldn't stand the waiting any longer, he heard it. A baby crying. Kaya appeared at the door, her face tired but glowing with joy. You have a daughter, she announced. Both mother and baby are healthy and strong. Elijah didn't remember moving, but suddenly he was inside the cabin, at Aida's side, looking down at the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby was perfect, impossibly small, impossibly precious, with a shock of dark hair and skin that was somewhere between his pale coloring and Aida's warm brown. Her name is Sarah, Aida said softly, after your first wife. I hope that is acceptable. Elijah couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He simply nodded, reaching out with one weathered finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. She gripped his finger with surprising strength, and he felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't thought possible. "Sarah," he whispered, "welcome to the world, little one. I'm your father, and I promise you I will be here. I will always be here." The baby opened her eyes, dark and unfocused, and seemed to look at him with the profound wisdom that newborns sometimes possess, as if she understood the weight of that promise and accepted it. Aida smiled, exhausted but radiant. "We did it, husband. We made a family." "We did," Elijah agreed, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "We made a family." That night, as Elijah sat beside Aita's bed holding his sleeping daughter, watching his wife rest after the ordeal of birth, he thought about the tracks in the snow that had brought them together, about the choices that had led to this moment, about the strange and winding path that had carried him from solitary grief to this fullness of life and love. He thought about Sarah, his first wife, and hoped she could see this, could know that he had found happiness again without forgetting her. He thought about Thomas, his first son, and promised silently that this daughter would grow up hearing stories about the brother she never met, about the family that had come before, and paved the way for the family that existed now. And he thought about the future, about the community they were building, about the life that stretched ahead with all its possibilities and challenges and joys. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, gentle flakes drifting down from a dark sky, covering the settlement in a blanket of white that would melt with spring's return. The snow that had nearly killed Aida had also brought her to him, had forced him out of his isolation, had given him back his life. "Thank you," he whispered to the falling snow, to the forces of chance and choice that had conspired to bring him here. "Thank you." The baby stirred in his arms, and he looked down at her tiny face, at the miracle of new life, of second chances, of redemption found in the most unlikely places. "I love you, Sarah," he said softly, "and I promise you a good life, a safe life, a life full of love and laughter and all the things your father was too afraid to believe he deserved." The baby sighed in her sleep, content and safe, and Elijah held her close, marveling at the weight of her, at the responsibility and privilege of being her father, at the terrifying and wonderful truth that he had been given another chance to get it right. And as he sat there in the quiet cabin, surrounded by the evidence of love and family and community, Elijah McAllister understood finally that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about learning from it, growing from it, building something new from the ashes of what had been lost. It was about choosing to live again, to love again, to try again despite the fear of failure. It was about tracks in the snow that led not to an ending, but to a beginning. The winter of 1925 returned to the room like a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder, pulling him back from memory to the present. He opened his eyes and found Emma staring at him with tears streaming down her young face, her hands clutched to her chest. "Grandpa," she whispered, "that's the most beautiful story I've ever heard." Elijah smiled, reaching out to touch her cheek with his weathered hand. "It's your story too, child. Your mother Sarah, the one this tale ended with. She grew up strong and good. She married a fine man, and they gave me you. 4 generations from that winter morning when I found your grandmother in the snow." "And Grandma Aida?" Emma asked. "When did she—" "2 years ago," Elijah said softly. "Peaceful, in her sleep, with me holding her hand. We had 40 years together, Emma. 40 years of building, of loving, of watching our family grow. She never forgot that I saved her life, and I never forgot that she saved mine right back." He stood slowly, his 98-year-old body protesting, and walked to the mantel. There, beside the old daguerreotype of Sarah and Thomas, sat another photograph. A woman with dark eyes and silver-streaked black hair, standing beside a broad-shouldered man with white hair and a gentle smile. Between them stood a young woman holding a baby. "That's your mother holding you," Elijah said, "and that's your grandmother and me on our 40th anniversary. Daniel took that picture. He lives just down the valley now, has grandchildren of his own." Emma came to stand beside him, looking at the photographs with new understanding. "The tracks in the snow," she said quietly. "They brought you everything." "No," Elijah corrected gently. "The tracks brought me a choice. I chose to follow them. I chose to care again. I chose to live." That's what made all the difference. He put his arm around Emma's shoulders, and together they stood before the photographs, before the faces of the dead and the living, before the evidence of a life redeemed. "Remember this, Emma," Elijah said. "No matter how lost you are, no matter how frozen your heart feels, there's always a chance for spring. Always a chance to follow the tracks and find something worth saving. Even if what you're really saving is yourself." Outside, the Wyoming winter continued to fall, soft and white and full of possibility. And inside by the fire, an old man and his granddaughter sat together, holding the stories of the past close, while the future waited, patient and kind, in the falling snow.